Welcome to episode 4 of Education, a Clusterfuck in Need of Repair. Episode 4 is called Killing, Learning, and Boring Kids to Death. Before we start, I'd like to emphasize that all ideas presented in this podcast are my own and do not reflect the thoughts, opinions, or positions of my employer, Emerson College, its programs, or its representatives. We seem to have turned teaching and learning into a transaction. We have replaced active contextualized learning with some pretty primitive shit. This episode is about behavior in schools, what's changed, why it's changed, and eventually what we can do about it. Due to the enormity and complexity of this topic, I'll be doing 3 episodes about behavior management, dropped about a week apart instead of our usual 2 weeks. This week focuses on the what and why, what's changed and why it has changed. Next week's episode will focus on what we can do to improve things, and the 3rd episode will be an interview with Amy Zarnofsky-Rollins, from whom I learned a lot of what I know about effective classroom climate in the urban high school classroom. When bad things happen, and there have been a lot of bad things over the past couple of decades, I always tell my students that there are 2 options. You can deal with the feelings, the fear, outrage, anger, despair, hopelessness, and then keep going, or you can lay down in the metaphorical road and wait for a metaphorical truck to come. The problem is that truck will come. And if it doesn't, by the time you realize it, you haven't prepared yourself for what comes next. Either way, you're out of the game. At 20, 21, 22 years old, that's early to be out of the game. People have been asking me if I plan to address the current political situation as it pertains to education on this podcast. Not right now. Not till we see how things really shake out as far as education goes. Right now, there's a lot of bluster and bullshit. I don't think it's productive to run around screaming, "The sky is falling," until we know that the sky is actually falling. Plus, I've been lying in the metaphorical road, curled up in the fetal position for the past 10 days, so it may take me a while to unfold, stretch my joints, and get moving. In the meantime, I've been pondering this magnet I have. Not round, but square, and not a refrigerator magnet. It's a desk magnet, since I chose to stick it on my desk instead of my refrigerator. It says, "Let go or be dragged." Let go or be dragged. I love it for its ambiguity of message. Is it telling me to let go of whatever I'm stubbornly clinging to lest I be dragged down by it? Or is it warning other people to let go of me as they try to stop me from doing what I want to do? It can go either way. It depends on what's happening. But I have another desk magnet, a rectangle. Now you're wondering if I have some sort of geometry fixation. I assure you, I do not. I almost failed geometry in high school. I do notice things, though, many things, including the shape of magnets. So sue me. Anyway, I have another desk magnet right next to "Let Go or Be Dragged." On it is an angry little girl, clenched fists on her hips, surrounded by beheaded dolls. It says, "Clara's dolls did not stop staring at her as they had been asked to." That magnet goes only one way. Sadly, the voice that's been urging me to let go over the past few weeks is not the voice of people who listen to this podcast. That voice has been consistently encouraging. "This is just what I needed, and thank you for saying what's going on." Always surprising to me. But that voice has been my own voice, questioning the value of any effort toward change at this discouraging time. What's the point? What's the point? That's been the mantra in my head. Then, at 4 a.m. last Thursday, I woke up, I'm a troubled sleeper, and realized that I could stand back up. It was a relieving feeling. Then a friend sent me a quote by Doris Lessing. Whatever you're meant to do, do it now. The conditions are always impossible. I tossed that in a mixed green salad with my favorite Joan of Arc quote. I know, but I fell in love with the quote before I found out who said it. Burned the fucking steak. Oy. Anyway, the quote is, I'm not afraid. I was born to do this. So to everyone who hopes that current events will shut me up, including me, let go or be dragged. So, after episode 3, I asked listeners to contribute what they do to address the human side of their students, even if they don't call it social emotional learning. I got a bunch of thoughtful, smart responses, too many to read here, but here are a few. A selection. I teach third, and I'm doing a lot to bring the joy of reading and talking about books back. I'm as honest and transparent as possible. I don't rely on bullshit. Now, do we really need to use potty talk? I'm just fucking with you. They get loud. It seems silly, but sometimes our first reaction is to try to quiet them down as soon as possible. But if something funny happens, I let them laugh, and I laugh with them. Knowing the same cultural topics as my middle school students has made it so much easier to connect with them. Their slang is constantly evolving, and me being able to understand it makes it feel like they can connect with me on a unique level. And finally, one teacher wrote about after the pandemic, students in theater classes were struggling in some unique ways. So this theater teacher created what she calls observation mode, in which students could opt to watch and reflect on theater experiences when they felt too overwhelmed emotionally or physically to participate. It kept them interested and prevented one student's upset from derailing an experience for the entire group. She found that students did not abuse the option, and I'd argue that the agency they experienced by being able to choose made them paradoxically more eager to participate, but that's just me. She says, quote, I'm realizing that observation mode is a strategy for the human side of my students and for me, because teachers have a human side too. What I discovered is that just having the option was enough for some students to feel better. Some got to actively practice regulation and a kind of constructive self-awareness and care that led to positive behavioral change. Man, life doesn't hand you a transition like that very often. So on to episode 4. I'm starting with a detour this time. What? I don't even know what this episode is about, I hear you cry. Stay with me, I'll get you there. Anyway, when one of my sons was about 17, he drove into the driveway with the local drug dealer in the passenger seat of his car. Lucky for us, that enterprising kid lived just down the street from us. And lucky for him, because I told him to walk home. Then I leveraged my son to hand over the pot he was in the process of buying from him and lectured him on the importance of 2 things. 1, paying your debts. For the car, he still owed us some money. Before buying things that you want. And 2, not getting high and driving on a junior license, which would result in his losing his license for a year. Bad. Also, we'd been hearing about how much stronger pot was now. This wasn't your grandmother's weed. So bad, bad, bad on all fronts. Anyway, I took the weed and put it in the freezer. After my own youthful drug use, I couldn't bring myself to throw it away, even though I'd stopped smoking pot 20 years before. What a waste. I once found a tiny baggie with 3 dank nugs in it on the sidewalk when I was going home from work at night. I couldn't even throw that away. Though I couldn't bring myself to smoke it either. I have this rule about knowing where your pot comes from. But a less cautious friend of mine was happy to smoke it. Oh my God, that was a detour within a detour. Get a grip on yourself. Anyway, fast forward 3 weeks, and Hessel, my life partner, and I were talking about the pot and theorizing about its strengths, so we decided to try it. I had a substantial number of comparison studies in which I'd participated, but Hessel had never smoked anything in his life, so we tried it. It was pot. We got a nice mellow buzz. It was pleasant, no big deal. It was, in fact, our grandmother's pot. The reason I'm talking about this is because that's the prevailing perception of the behavior of kids in schools. It's off the charts, worse than ever before. Not your grandmother's bad behavior. A whole new level of hoodlummery, destruction, sociopathic crazy shit. So I decided to look into that a bit before talking about how to intervene effectively. I'm of the sometimes unpopular old-fashioned position that it's good to have the info before making sweeping statements about the problem and the solutions. Oh my God, I'm your grandmother's podcaster. Oy. So, what I found suggests that there has been an uptick in behaviors that are on the more extreme side, especially since kids came back to school after COVID, though how much more is very hard to determine. In the past, we didn't have the phones and the internet to report and amplify every event. We do now. Be that as it may, in schools, we're seeing behavior that used to be more often reserved for the bus ride home. In the not-too-distant past, pre-No Child Left Behind, after a long day of following the rules, sitting still, being spoken to in ways that no adult would tolerate, we released kids onto the buses with a sigh of relief and sent them in packs of 50 to ride home, with only a low-paid bus driver to provide adult oversight. And that driver needed to pay attention to the road. We counted on them to get our kids home safely. So even in the old days from which I sprang, bad shit was happening. My sister had a cigarette tamped out on her ankle, for example. Yes, smoking on a school bus and using a human as an ashtray. I think that's fairly bad shit. A detour. In about the year 2000, I was doing playmaking in the town in which I lived with my 3 kids, and we were creating a show about the challenges of riding the school bus. My interest resulted in part from a repeating incident involving my youngest son, who was age 5 at that time. A little shithead started calling him gay every morning and afternoon on the bus. Now, Lucas knew what gay meant because we have a bunch of gay friends, but he was confused about why the kid would think he was gay. I called the school and reported the problem, but there was no change in the little sociopath's behavior. Okay, he wasn't a sociopath yet, but does little shithead really sound better? Probably not. Anyway, since the school seemed uninterested in addressing the situation, I told Lucas he should respond, "I think you're confused. I'm only 5, so I don't have a sexual orientation yet." He said it word for word. Then he got in trouble for saying the word sex on the bus. Fuck me. Anyway, back to my point. So I was creating an original show with the 3rd through 6th graders called When Your Back is Turned, Life on the Bus. I asked them to tell me the worst thing they'd ever seen happen on the bus. The answers that blew my mind included, 1, a flute protege had his $2,500 instrument thrown out of the back window of the bus, and it was run over by a car and destroyed. 2, a 6th grader jumped over the back of a bus seat and landed on the leg of a 3rd grader, breaking her femur. And 3, 6th graders suspended a 2nd grader upside down out of the bus window, holding him by his calves and knees, while the bus was moving. Now that's really bad shit. Not your grandmother's bad shit. And this was in tiny, wealthy Whitetown, Massachusetts. Safe, friendly, a space out of time with the social problems of the day. Yeah. In an interesting coda when the parents saw the show, there was a shocked silence in the audience. Then a single voice came out of the darkness. A father. "He's never riding the bus again." Knowledge can be a bitch. But most of the bad behavior in schools has remained pretty stable across time. Kids lie, cheat, skip school, bully each other, drink, do drugs. The really bad kids sell drugs, arrange fights after school between kids who can't say no, threaten each other with violence, etc. This has happened since I was in school in the 60s and 70s. when I taught in the 80s and 90s, when my own kids were in school in the 2000s. But there's been an uptick in the bad stuff, and we certainly hear about it more thanks to social media. And that whole hitch or teacher challenge is some sick shit. But those bus behaviors, now we're seeing increased levels of those types of behaviors during the school day. In classrooms, hallways, and playgrounds, overseen by teaching professionals, counselors, and administrators who theoretically are prepared to stop them. So why is this happening? I have a theory that's based on a misunderstanding of cause and consequence. We look at the kid's behavior as the cause and our response to it as the consequence. In reality, we need to look back one more step and consider how our behavior, our approach to curriculum, our rigidity in responding to kids' needs, because I don't have the time to deal with each kid, I have to get through this curriculum for the test. And schools which are structured to meet the needs of the system, not the needs of the learners, are generating the conditions for that bad behavior in the first place. A colleague sent this to me. My public school was founded on the idea that teachers would create their own curriculums that met the standards, yet used PBL, project-based learning, as the driving force. Things were going swimmingly for years. Last year, they were forced to abandon this because the district was forcing every school to start following a specified curriculum for each of the core subjects. Now this year, nobody can understand why the behaviors are worse than ever, the kids aren't improving, and the test scores are low. If only the teachers had the time and resources to teach SEL, but the standardized curriculums don't allow for that. Cause and consequence. There are three main components umbrellaed under this theory. 1, we are boring kids to death. To death. I was a teacher before No Child Left Behind in a wealthy suburb west of Boston. I was a resource using drama as a teaching tool in core subject areas. So I saw a lot of teaching. Math, science, language arts, world languages, social studies, health, but not phys ed. Even at that time, I knew I'd hung upside down from the uneven parallel bars for the last time. And the reason I was working with those teachers in those classrooms was because they asked me to. They recognized that using drama to engage their students improved their learning. Once testing started, once the Titanic hit the iceberg, there was no time for such frivolity. It was skill and drill teaching to the state test every minute of every day. In one school in New Hampshire, I was observing a young woman doing her student teaching with a 4th grade class. She had received instruction on how to conduct the class in a professional development workshop the day before, along with all of the other 4th grade teachers. They were all supposed to teach the exact same lesson at the exact same time in the exact same way. The principal, about whom I have very few positive things to say, was pacing in the hall, looking through the little window in the classroom doors, making sure that these instructions were followed to the letter. Welcome to prison, my friends. Anyway, the kids were reading an interesting article in Junior National Geographic about oil spills in Alaska and the impact of those spills on seals, birds, and other wildlife. It was a glossy magazine lit with lots of beautiful pictures. Interesting, right? I thought so, until I realized what they were doing. Each child would read until they reached the answer to a question written on the board, tracking each word with a finger. Then they had to stop reading, and the teacher would check each child's finger to be sure they were on the correct spot. There were 25 kids in the class. It was a lengthy process. Then someone would be called on to say the answer, and they move on to the next question. This went on for 35 minutes. There were 6 questions about the 4-paragraph article. The real problem, though, was that it was a heterogeneously grouped class, multiple different skill levels. Some of the kids were skilled readers who found the answer in 10 seconds or so. Then there were 4 kids who were very challenged readers. Once it took the slowest little girl a full 3 minutes to find the answer, while everyone else waited, finger on the page and hand in the air. At the end of this endless slog, the student teacher asked the kids why they thought they had done this. The slowest little girl raised her hand instantly, face beaming. So if there's ever an oil spill, we'll know how to help clean up the birds and seals. The other kids looked at her, impressed, certain that she was right. Well, no, the student teacher explained uncomfortably. It's so if you had to find the answers to questions on the kneecap test, New Hampshire state standardized test, you'll know you can do it this way. The little girl was crestfallen, and the other kids looked like they'd been tricked. I was horrified. Later, I asked the student teacher what she thought of the lesson, and she burst into tears. I felt like I was torturing them, she said. I was impressed by her insight. The next time I arrived to observe that class, there was a lot of hubbub. One of the fastest readers in the class, a kid named Thomas, had just come back from the nurse. He had stuck a metal paperclip into the electrical outlet. Zappo. The classroom teacher was looking at him earnestly. Thomas, she asked gently, why did you do that? You're 9. You know better than that. He looked at her with tears in his eyes and said, I just had to get out of this room. Cause and consequence. Number 2, we have turned teaching and learning into a transaction. We have replaced engaged, active, contextualized learning as the things that motivate kids to learn with some pretty primitive shit. Because when what we're asking of kids is developmentally inappropriate, decontextualized, or just plain boring, kids act out. They withdraw, they resist, they obstruct. They use their agency to make teaching as difficult as it can possibly be. And it's not easy at the best of times. So we turn to behaviorist strategies as a last resort. We try to threaten kids into learning. We'll take away recess. You won't be allowed to play on your sports teams. We'll call your parents and send you to the office. Or we try to bribe them into learning. Pizza parties, ice cream socials, PBIS tickets, Disney dollars, fake bucks named after the school, often with the smiling face of the principal on them, rolling trays of tchotchkes in every room. Hand in your homework? Here's a fake buck. Read a book and answer the 10-question computer quiz correctly? A Disney dollar. And use that funny money for the class auction, a trip to the class goodie box, etc. Fun, fun, fun for the well-behaved skilled learner. For the others, a regular reminder of their failure to hit the mark. And research shows that when you reward a behavior with money, toys, love, food, the child comes to believe within a few seconds, that the activity itself has no value, that the value lies in the reward. There are 4 primitive drivers for humans: food, love, sex, and fear. We are hammering away on 3 out of 4 of those a lot of time in classrooms. A detour, but on point. Another student teacher in a small town in New Hampshire, in a looped 4th, 5th grade classroom, got a great student teaching site. The classroom teacher was young, energetic, recently trained in a range of constructivist methods. She had word walls, a math center, hands-on approaches to everything. And Candy, the student teacher, was already showing signs of teaching talent in her Cluster 1 placement, which I'd observed in the previous semester. I had high hopes. At the last observation, however, things fell apart over the use of fake bucks as a fundamental tool. In the course of a 45-minute lesson, I observed 9 transactions during which kids gained or lost these precious dollars based on a range of things. Come into class on time and put your homework on the top right corner of your desk, earn $1. Late, lose $1. Don't have your homework? Ooh, another $1. Win at the spelling game they were playing? $1, $2, or $3 for the last 3 spellers left standing. Fail to stay behind the teacher's eye line after you're out? Ooh, you owe $1. And on and on. It was painful to watch, in part since the same kids were succeeding and not succeeding again and again. There was this one little boy, Riley, who came in late. Uncombed hair, dirty shirt, no homework. He got out early in the spelling game, failed to watch the others spell, and was last to line up for computer. By my calculations, he was down 6 fake bucks after 45 minutes in school. John, who was taunting Riley and snickering about him with other kids, won $7 in the same period. When I asked Candy about it later, she was defensive. Well, we have to have some system or it wouldn't be fair. Plus, the kids don't always buy toys or snacks. They can also pay to have lunch with the teachers. I suggested that Riley might enjoy having lunch with the teachers too. Candy said, "Oh, Riley owes me $1 million ever since his mom left the family." The look on my face stopped her mid-sentence. Primitive drivers. Food. Love. And in Riley's case, fear. Fear of humiliation of other kids. I'll tell you what I told Candy. Learning is not a transaction. It's not a transaction. Cause and consequence. Number 3, we overreact. We put cops in schools. A slight detour. I remember an article in Time or Newsweek magazine from about 20 years ago, which reported on a kindergartner in Florida who pushed and swore at his teacher. Shocking. Unheard of at that time, not anymore, of course. But in tones of judgment, the author talked at length about negligent parenting, the influence of video games, violence in TV and movies, bad news friends, and incompetent teachers. Then, buried in the middle of the article was a tiny 2-sentence paragraph that mentioned that, as a result of the need to make kids readers by the end of kindergarten, due to standardized testing that started in first grade, all recess had been eliminated for all kids in the school. They even ate lunch at their desks to prepare for their futures. Cause and consequence. Coincidentally, the next day I was teaching at an elementary school in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I was waiting in the hall when 2 kindergartners walked back. They were so tiny. Anyway, pulling the milk wagon down to the office. They sauntered along chatting, the little boy trailing his fingers lightly along the wall. I thought of the 5-year-olds in Florida at the other school, sitting at their desks day after day. Well, thank heaven someone cares about their futures. I thought these kids are probably going to be total losers. No, that's not what I thought. I thought it was incredibly fucked up. But you already knew that, I hope. Okay, back on the tracks. In 2024, when researching extreme kid behaviors for this episode, Emily, my researcher extraordinaire, came across a story of a 6-year-old who brought a gun to school and shot their teacher. This was even more egregious than it seems on its face because several people in the school had been told that the child was violent and had a gun. It was ignored. And now the teacher, who fortunately survived, is suing the school for $40 million. Now, I think anyone would agree that in that circumstance, an armed cop would be an asset in that moment. The problem is he wasn't in the room, so it happened anyway, and there are a lot of unintended negative consequences of putting cops in schools. For example, shooting your teacher is not the typical bad behavior in elementary schools. But we hear about it because it makes for engaging news. If it bleeds, it leads. That's a slogan in journalism. Nice, huh? And those security guards end up intervening in a lot of behavior that falls in the more typical kid behavior zone. Talking while the teacher's talking, kicking your neighbor's sneakers, potty talk, running in the halls, not doing your homework, and other forms of communication that the kid's needs aren't being met by what's happening in class. Which results in a tantruming 7-year-old transported to the police station in cuffs and held there for 7 hours without his parents being informed. True story. As though that is a reasonable solution or solves anything. But it definitely expunges that child's trust in the school and in his teacher, and expunges his parents' trust in the school and in his teacher. And at the middle and high school levels, it results in kids having early interactions with the criminal justice system that often aren't necessary and are the first step on the school-to-prison pipeline, which is a topic for another episode. But these are certainly not your grandmother's solutions. An interesting detour. Pedro Noguera writes about a challenge urban high school in which an elderly woman from the neighborhood served as a security officer. She was able to break up fights, stop behaviors, etc. because the kids knew her. She knew them and their world. She had credibility and could suppress conflict instead of escalating it. Now that's your grandmother's solution. Cause and consequence. I want to talk about this episode for a second. It's very story-oriented rather than data-oriented. Why? Because there's plenty of data on this topic. I could make lists of references for you. I'm an academic, you know. That's my stock in trade. But I'm not going to, and that's because there's so much data. It's overwhelming. It makes the problem monolithic and almost unapproachable. It triggers our amygdala, and our reactions become primitive, outsized, and often oppressive. And if you need proof that that's not effective, read the news for 5 minutes. Things are bad, bad, bad. Plus, I'm a storyteller. I illustrate my points with stories, examples that help the listener understand, at least partially, why I think what I think, what I've seen that informs my understanding of the research, the practice I've seen employed in school after school. I have more stories than I'd ever have time to tell you, and you'd get tired of listening if you aren't already. But I think it's important to remember that the dynamics we're discussing here happen to real people, children, with real feelings, with lives and families and aspirations that are negatively impacted by the way we treat kids and teachers in schools. Cause and consequence. Cause and consequence. But for the moment, what can we do? We can't undo social media, though I think we need to try. But we can do something about the part that's in our control as teachers. We can make learning interesting again. We can help kids want to learn, want to be in school by utilizing project-based learning, multiple intelligences teaching, hands-on tasks, and helping them understand how what they're learning is connected to their lives. We can employ constructivist teaching. We can make what happens in schools feel like it has meaning for them, that it's something they want to do. Will it fix everything? No. I'm not a blue skies type person. I'm a realist. Surprise! But it will help. I've seen it help. But those are stories for another day. Look, teachers aren't magic. We can't undo society and its influences. But we're in those rooms with the kids. We are the front line here. And we can do what we know how to do, including using social emotional learning to create a calmer, more stable environment in which to learn. Kids are curious until we teach them not to be. And when we give them something interesting to do, in an environment in which they feel safe and known, in which their skills are noticed and applauded, in which they have a sense of agency, they're less likely to look for bad things to do. We need to harness their brains for learning, or they'll find something less savory to be interested in. Fed by ideas on social media, movies, video games, we leave them to their most primitive drivers: food, love, sex, and fear. Let's stop doing that, okay? If you have an example of a time when you successfully advocated for yourself and your students in order to give them the learning experiences they need, I would love to hear it. You can DM me on my Instagram, Education Clusterfuck, or email me, at education, clusterfck@gmail.com. Let's share strategies and turn this fucking ship. I want to thank you for listening today. If you have time, I'd really appreciate it if you did a review or shared it with someone else you think might be interested. And I'll talk at you next week when we continue this 3-episode arc on behavior management and classroom climate.
J like the letter, I'm making several waves. I know the mission the same. I made a splash, now all of my passes last like running a race with Usain. I keep it coming like this a buffet. And if I'm stumbling, I'm in the graves. Never gon' fumble it. I get the bag and I run with it, gunning it, gunning it, gunning it, gunning it.